Wonderful. Well, thank you all for for joining today for this presentation, which I hope will be educational and entertaining as well. I think everyone here may know, but for anyone who doesn't, I'm Neal Schindler. Been the director of Jewish Family Services here in Spokane since 2014, and I lived in Seattle from 2002 to 2011. Yes, Gary knows Seattle like the back of his hand, and he's over there right now, actually. So I lived in Seattle for a little over 9 years. And during that time, one of my most significant and memorable experiences, and certainly my most important Jewish experience, was being a resident organizer and a community member at the Ravenna Kibbutz. And I know not too many people in Spokane and certainly elsewhere know what the kibbutz was. So I wanted to just start out by talking a little bit about what it was, drawing from, in part, the Wikipedia page about the kibbutz, which I believe I wrote many years ago. So it's like I'm quoting myself. And then I'll also draw a little bit on a 2009 Seattle Times article about the kibbutz as well. And I would say, during the presentation, please feel free to ask questions. You're welcome to do it in the chat. You're also welcome to unmute or stay unmuted and ask live, whatever you want to do. I think we'll keep it fairly informal, and we'll have some time afterwards as well for questions. So the Ravenna Kibbutz was a non-denominational Jewish intentional community from 2007 until 2012. And it was located in the Ravenna neighborhood of Seattle, which those who know Seattle will know is on the north end, not too far from Green Lake. The 3 rented houses of the kibbutz and 1 rented apartment were home to 20 resident organizers who both lived on the kibbutz in one of these structures and also planned public programs such as Shabbat dinners, Jewish movie nights, and many, many more. I'll talk more about the variety of programs in a minute. And the kibbutz was an example of co-housing. So it wasn't a true commune. Co-housing meaning a model of people living together where each household or person gets a relatively small amount of space of their own, either in this case, a room or a small apartment. And then there is a lot of communal space, a lot of space that can be used by anyone. For just hanging out, for doing programs, cooking, whatever. So gardening in addition. So House Aleph, the original kibbutz house, was supported at the beginning by the Moisha House program, which you may not have heard of. The Moisha House program, which still exists, offers financial and other resources to young Jewish adults interested in hosting a certain number of public events per month and living together while doing so. So basically like a rent subsidy or stipend. And so Aleph began that way, but the thing about Moisha House is the events are supposed to be for Jewish young adults and friends in their 20s and early 30s. And we did not want to simply focus on that age bracket. We wanted to be able to invite all ages. And so it was a Moisha House, but in addition to that, we had events that were all ages, and those were under sort of the umbrella of the kibbutz, which at that time was unofficial, but existed. And then a couple of years after the kibbutz was founded in 2007, we added the additional houses, House Bet and House Gimel. They were not affiliated with Moisha House, so they could host events for any age. And they played host to events like Jewish holiday celebrations, weekly Shabbat dinners, monthly open mic nights, film screenings. I myself hosted an Israeli film series, house concerts, yoga classes, storytelling events, meditation sessions, lots of different kinds of things. Resident organizers at the kibbutz ranged from secular to modern Orthodox in their religious views, and they varied also in their Jewish practices. Several kept kosher, while others did not, and only some were Shomer Shabbos. Nonetheless, all kibbutz households maintained kosher dairy dishes, silverware, and other kitchen implements. The kibbutz members, kibbutz residents, all worked together to make sure that those who did observe Shabbos were able to do so. So, for example, the famous taping the light switch on Friday, before Shabbos, so that in the middle of the night, if you have to go to the bathroom, you actually have light there and you don't have to turn on the light. So the history of the kibbutz, I kind of touched on a little. It was founded in the fall of 2007 by three people, Joel Rothschild, Moisha Stern, and Tamar Libicki. And the community's first official event was a potluck dinner in October of 2007, which is very appropriate considering the sort of potluck, ethos of the whole thing. In founding the kibbutz, Rothschild in particular hoped to recreate aspects of his positive experience as a member of the kosher co-op at Oberlin College. And I myself also attended Oberlin College. I was also part of the co-op system for housing and dining, but I was not a member of kosher co-op. I knew of it though. And I was there sometimes peeling potatoes and cutting onions and crying at Hanukkah times. The kibbutz acquired its second house, nicknamed Bet, in January of 2009, and a third house, Gimel, was added in June 2009, expanding the number of resident organizers to 16. In September of 2009, the kibbutz annexed the basement of Bet to add 2 residents in an apartment down there, and then 2 more resident organizers moved into an apartment across the street. So that brought us to 20, and that was a busy year. 2009 was a busy year for the kibbutz. So 3 years after that, 2012, sadly, the kibbutz closed after the building's landlords decided to sell the properties. I think it was a moment in Seattle real estate, and they wanted to do that. So a few notes from the Seattle Times article that I mentioned, June 2009, in the middle of that busy year. So the Times mentioned that the kibbutz was inspired by other local co-housing arrangements as much as by the socialist Israeli collective farms of old. So I should note that we did grow fruits and vegetables, just not in amounts that we could sell. So they were for us, but it was an urban kibbutz. It wasn't, the traditional kibbutz of Israeli renown. So the Seattle Times very kindly, I think, called the kibbutz a magnet for Jewish young adults moving to Seattle. They mentioned that it was on a quiet residential street near Bagel Oasis and Tree of Life Judaica. At the very least, I think Tree of Life Judaica sadly is no longer there. I don't remember whether Bagel Oasis is still there. But more importantly, perhaps, the kibbutz was strategically situated near a cluster of North End Seattle synagogues representing nearly every denomination. So this was a very intentional move on the part of the founders that people who needed to walk to shul on Shabbat morning could walk to shul, or Friday night. I mean, either way. So the kibbutz residents, as the Times noted, shared chores and paid rent based on the size of their room and their event planning commitments. In other words, to an extent, if you planned and organized more programs, you would get a reduction in rent in accordance with that, because that was labor that was being recognized as valuable and so compensated in reduced rent. There was a point at which you no longer could reduce your rent anymore, but this is the idea, that it was a motivating factor. And kibbutzniks described their living situation in many ways: Jewish co-housing, a neo-shtetl, an intentional community, or a non-denominational gathering place. So, any questions so far about any of what I've talked about, the nature of the kibbutz? Okay, I am going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can start a little slideshow that I have put together, which will have both photos and some audio from my interviews with former kibbutznikim and a video as well. So we've talked about the Wikipedia article. Can everyone see and hear? Let me know if you can't see and hear. So the Ravenna Kibbutz, I wanted to pull up a sample list of assignments for residents to give you a sense of what kinds of events we did. So this is from February 2009. And at that time, there were 2 houses, Aleph and Bet, and 6 members, resident organizers, I mean. And so going through the list, the first kibbutznik listed here, Deborah, she was co-hosting a Russian Shabbat dinner with another member of the kibbutz. During the time the kibbutz existed, it served as kind of an informal hub for the Jewish Russian community in Seattle. As one of the founders, Moisha Stern, is and was a Russian Jew, and so brought many members of the community into the fold, such that there was even a Russian language Shabbat. And then we did some excursions. There was a coffee trip to the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture, a challah baking workshop that month, my 30th birthday, which was a sizable event. I don't know what the nature is of this puppet show, but I really wish I did. Apparently there was a puppet show that month. And Coffee House was the monthly open mic, performance space, kind of talent show kind of event. Then a Rosh Chodesh bonfire, and that was a monthly event as well. Rosh Chodesh, of course, marking the new moon every month, and we'd have a bonfire and often a potluck too. So every Shabbat dinner, which was nearly every Friday in the kibbutz's existence, 2 kibbutz resident organizers would co-host. And so it alternated, of course, who would do that and which house it was in. So Moisha House Bowling, this would have been an event that fit the sort of Moisha House parameters, young adults in their 20s and early 30s, and we apparently went bowling. An easy hike, we did some hikes and some camping as a group, including community members who didn't live in the kibbutz, of course. Many attended these events as well. Let's see if there's anything else that jumps out here. So under my listing, a movie night, not surprisingly. And yeah, I think, oh, Moisha House Bowls. Apparently I led a Moisha House bowling excursion as well. So hopefully that gives you kind of a little taste of what we were doing. And again, these events were not just attended by residents. That would have been, you know, relatively small potatoes. There was a significant community, dozens and dozens of people. I don't know if it was 100, but it was a good number who would attend various things during the course of the year. So a few tweets from the kibbutz years. Are you coming to our Marksathon, pre-Thanksgiving Marx Brothers movie night on Harpo's birthday? And then the next one, singer-songwriter Julie Geller performs tomorrow at House Gimel following a potluck brunch. Bring friends and food. Julie Geller was a local Jewish singer-songwriter. Come to House Gimel tomorrow, March 5th, and eat your greens. Shabbat dinner will be a blues-busting greens-orama. And finally, come to East West, which was a bookstore, on March 10th for a presentation about the benefits of intentional community. Neal from Ravenna Kibbutz will be there, and indeed I was a panelist. So to get us back to the slideshow. So here is House Aleph. This was the original kibbutz house, and it served as Moisha House Seattle for a time. There's now currently another Moisha House Seattle that is obviously not this house. So here are a few snapshots of kibbutz life. These are all from the Seattle Times article. They were taken by Erica Schultz. So we have here at the upper left a tableau with a rubber chicken, some Manischewitz, of course, a partially used Havdalah candle, an unused Havdalah candle, and some kind of little plastic gremlin toy there. Tamar Libicki raking the front lawn of Aleph. This is a shot from a block party that the kibbutz organized for neighbors and also the owners of the houses that we were renting. You can see that the street was sectioned off for volleyball. Here is a rather undignified picture of me being fed a grape by Miley Petard, who we will hear from a little later. And Tamar and Joel probably taking a challah out of the oven as Shaul watches. So here we have a picture of kibbutznikim relaxing in hammocks and lawn chairs on the front yard of Aleph. Here we have Debs Gardner and Zoe Dash, 2 kibbutz residents, gargling show tunes at the coffee house event, which was the performance space open mic talent show thing. So I wish I had the video or even audio of this, but unfortunately we just have this picture. Here is Masha Stern making Hamantaschen. And you can see the final product turned out pretty nice looking, although these are obviously pre-baked. This may have been a Hamantaschen workshop, or it may have just been Masha making Hamantaschen. A truffle making workshop at House Gimel. And here is a kibbutz community hike So these are some residents, but some folks who are just part of the larger kibbutz community going on a hike together. Some bonfires, whether for Rosh Chodesh or Lag BaOmer, bonfires were a big part of life in the kibbutz. So we had a fire pit, we had some guitar music, and general camaraderie and merriment. Here is a pumpkin for Halloween, in which someone has carved the word kibbutz in English and then in Hebrew as well. So that's pretty cool. Danielle Soffer, one of the resident organizers, in her Purim costume, dressed as a Tamagotchi, which is a digital pet, which really kind of dates someone if they know what that is. And then here we have a spring retreat with resident organizers. It's maybe all of the resident organizers at the time, in a group photo, and then hard at work, clearly. And here's Apple Day at the kibbutz. So people picked apples, they made applesauce, they played the card game that's called Apples to Apples, and apparently it was very fun. So moving on, Shabbat dinner was really the heart of kibbutz life, and one of the sort of most reliable aspects of it. We almost never missed a Friday night. So an early Shabbat dinner, also a very pixelated photo at House Aleph. Here we have Shabbat dinner at House Aleph a bit later in the kibbutz's evolution. See, it's quite crowded. House Aleph does not have a very large room, at least for the purpose of Shabbat dinner hosting. This is a great photo from the Seattle Times article. Kibbutz residents and community members bring bowls and plates from House Aleph to House Bet in anticipation of Shabbat dinner. Here is a Shabbat dinner at House Gimel, so a long table. House Gimel was the largest house and was good for larger events, whether seders or Shabbat dinners. I think someone has traffic noise. Yeah, thank you. This is another, I think it's a Shabbat, oh, we missed it. I think it's a Shabbat dinner rather than a Seder, although it looks a bit Seder-like. And this is at House Aleph, a long table. This is a photo that ran in the JT News, which used to be the Seattle Jewish newspaper, with an article about the end of the kibbutz, so kind of poignant. But this is a nice, well-attended Shabbat dinner. And then sometimes it was picnic Shabbat. Here I am, hamming it up, no pun intended. Here's Tamar posing with some heirloom tomatoes. She was trying to simulate their appearance with her face. You can judge whether she succeeded. Tamar making soup, Josh making challah. Very nice, in the Aleph kitchen. Some food that represents kind of the bounty that was often there, Shabbat dinner. Spring pasta, some latkes, so probably this was around Hanukkah, I'm guessing. Figs, a pizza, and then some of the spreads we had. Outdoors, indoors, lots of pasta salads, lots of salads in general. When you have a potluck and you're kosher dairy, you get lots of salads. So the Ravenna Kibbutz ended up in a lot of different media outlets over the years. Obviously, I mentioned the Wikipedia article, which I think we did ourselves. But this is a little snip from the Seattle Times article, which is still online. We were featured in Haaretz, in the Jewish Daily Forward. And also we have an entry in Urban Dictionary, which is kind of funny. And finally, the JT News I mentioned earlier is the former Jewish newspaper in Seattle. Debs Gardner wrote an article about the end of the kibbutz, which is what this piece is called. So we got some media love. And now I wanted to talk a little bit about the interviews I did with former kibbutz residents. I talked to a number of former kibbutz residents. I didn't have time to cram all of it into this presentation, but I wanted to give you some highlights. Sergei Feldman was a poet and other things too, but he was a poet who lived at the kibbutz in House Gimel for several years. I emailed him, he emailed me back. I asked him what was a favorite thing about kibbutz life, and he said, not surprisingly, Shabbat dinner. He said, it's an incredible feeling to know that you're more than welcome at a huge, chatty, delicious dinner every single Friday. I asked him what was a hard thing about kibbutz life, and he said consensus decision-making. We didn't have an official hierarchy, but still people wielded different amounts of power. Looking back on it, I think there was more politics than I realized, he said. And finally, he mentioned that he has stayed in touch with various kibbutz, former kibbutz residents who still live in Seattle. And he actually met his wife through the kibbutz, Tamar. So he also mentioned to me, which I thought I would include, he and Tamar were able to host Shabbat dinners through the pandemic outside. And I asked how he did it. And he said, well, they had a $180 carport to block out the rain and snow, LED lights so everyone could see, a fire pit to keep warm after everyone was done eating, 2 to 3 tables about 6 to 10 feet away from each other in a triangle, and each table had 1 household, 2 to 3 layers of pants and socks, etc. A wedding-style buffet, so 1 table goes at a time for food, and extra hygiene. I like this detail, holding the challah during hamotzi with napkins instead of naked hands, quote unquote, and lots of hand sanitizer and so forth. And I mention this not because this is a kibbutz thing, but because I feel like it's in the spirit of kibbutz adaptability and kind of community feeling. So I thought that was a neat tidbit. I also spoke to Moisha Stern. As I mentioned, she is a kibbutz co-founder. I asked her what a highlight of kibbutz life was for her. She said the cat mitzvah of Iggy, the cat. Iggy was Deb's gardener's cat, and when she lived at the kibbutz, Iggy turned 13. And so we had a big party for Iggy, including singing, and we did the hora and lots of wonderful things like that. She also mentioned having community and such an easy reach was pretty amazing. She learned to make challah while at the kibbutz. She did say a difficult thing about living there was the rate of turnover, often having to look for new housemates. And then her last statement I really liked, which is, mostly eating food with other Jews is my kind of Jewishness. It took me a while to come to terms with that. But after the kibbutz, that was pretty much solidified. So I certainly appreciate that. Let's see. I wanted to play you a couple clips from my interview with Maili Petard. Maili was not a resident, but was a co-organizer of the Coffee House, the open mic and talent night event. And so I'll play a couple clips. The first one, she uses the word minchag, which is an accepted tradition or group of traditions in Judaism, how Jews practice Judaism. And there's a tiny bit of swearing in it, but hopefully that will be okay. I asked her what a favorite thing was for her about the kibbutz.
I feel like I'm in a different space when I have to be an organizer.
I have to start it at 20 seconds, I guess. All right, let's do that. 20 seconds. Oh, well, okay, let's try that again.
I feel like I'm in a
okay.
Because of the unique kind of space that it was one of the few places that I could just show up and like know that I wouldn't know everybody there, but I would know that generally I would have some good conversations regardless of whether or not I knew somebody. And like, I didn't have to try hard to put out a specific image. I could just be like the weirdo that I was in the very specific, whatever form of that it was. Mm-hmm. And in the Jewish world, that is so vanishingly rare. And it's because there was like a bunch of different kinds of humans there with a whole different range of experiences. Like we had queer folks there who were like non-postury about like you are either a certain kind of queer or you don't like fit in. We had like straight folks who were totally like whatever and like I went to Oberlin, like I get it. Like we had people who grew up all over the world. We had like people who had just been in Seattle, people who had grown up in Seattle. We had a whole different range of minchags. So like your minchag being different from everybody else's minchag didn't fucking matter. Like, it's just kind of one of those comparing notes, like, oh, you did this. Oh, you did this. Oh, wild. I had a friend who did this. Cool. Okay. And like, sometimes the minchags would rotate depending on who was there. You know, it was like this, it was so normalizing to be different. Mm-hmm. And that gave everybody space to be themselves.
So I wanted to play one more clip from my interview with Maili. I asked her what the influence of the kibbutz has been on her identity and life, better than I did before. in what ways do you feel like your experience at the kibbutz, in various ways, in what ways has it significantly influenced you in terms of your view of things, how you lived, your Jewish identity, whatever ways in which you think it's had an influence, meaningful influence?
Oh my God, it's so profound that I feel like that's going to be a little tricky to put into words, but because it's so many different things. But I'll try. I think that this all goes back to the thing that I said earlier about being different, being normalized, and like I think it really like primed my appreciation for the amount of untold history in the diaspora. Because there's just so many different Jewish experiences and they're so cool and we should know about a lot of them. And like our history is just so complicated for so many reasons. And like it's all really important. And we all have a lot of that generational trauma, like from different sources, but kind of the same in various ways. And there's so much connecting to do around those differences and around the parts that are shared. There's like it built my appreciation for plurality and being able to connect to people across different backgrounds. Like I have some OTD friends. I have a couple of like classid friends and from friends that are weirdo from Nicks. Like those totally exist, it turns out.
Yeah.
You know, and being able to find a way to just like have especially like right now things are so messed up and so divided. It's like hard to feel like you can connect with folks who are different, but it just requires everybody to like have an ability to respect and appreciate where other folks are coming from. It's that intolerance that creates those divisions and bigotry, not like people being different like by themselves.
Right.
And it just like really showed me what, you know, an open Jewish space could look like. And
so a couple of impressions from Miley about her experience at the kibbutz. I'm going to play a couple clips from the next person I interviewed, but I'm going to leave a couple out because I'm running a little behind on time and I want to leave some time for questions or comments. So this is Sebastian Schulman. Sebastian is the executive director currently of Klez Canada, the premier klezmer organization in Canada, as you might expect. And he is a former kibbutz resident. He also helped bring us last month's talk about klezmer history. So I asked him about favorite experiences at the kibbutz, and he talked a bit about the Shabbat dinners and holiday meals.
I think it's hard to sort of,
let me get to where we
but if I am forced to sort of pinpoint things, I think our Shabbos meals and holiday meals, there's sometimes huge communal gatherings in the Zen room.
The Zen room.
Yeah. They were pretty amazing. I can think of our Seder in the Zen room. The first Seder was in the Zen room, and then the second Seder was with like 40 people or 50 people or something crazy like that. And then the next night, the second Seder was just like 6 of us. Like we weren't literally hungover, but it felt like that. But I just remember that first Seder where, you know, like it was this huge table and you couldn't really see everybody, but you sort of still felt connected to everybody. And very much sticks in my mind. And I think about basically every Pesach now. 2 things that happen at the Seder. Dane reading a poem that, you know, original poem that she wrote about Shifra the midwife. That was just
greatest hits now.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of these pieces of, you know, the story that people don't know, that people don't think about, and she, you know, makes it, you know, puts it at the center, and it's an amazing poem. And then the other thing, and this was a bit more ephemeral, was Sergei's reading of It Happened at Midnight. which, you know, was just kind of, it was super late when it was happening. And it was just like this weird, wacky, jazzy, scatty thing. And it's again, I think it's sort of the same thing. It's a similar kind of thing. It's a text in the Haggadah that like nobody really reads, nobody ever gets to, nobody pays attention to. Sort of like Dane put a light on a piece of the story. Sergi put a light on this text that, you know, certainly like in other Seders I've been to, is not really a memorable thing. And just being goofy and being ourselves really brought it, you know, to the fore and brought it to life. And it's very hard to describe. It was just like, you know, spontaneous and very Sergi and very crazy and wonderful. And I think, you know, very evocative of those big communal meals in general.
Okay, so one more clip from Sebastian, and then I'll talk a bit about my own memories of the kibbutz myself. So, I asked him to talk a little more about the community feeling of the kibbutz. He gave me this anecdote.
Talk about how one time I went home, Shabbos was in the Zen room again, and there was a big pile of shoes at the entrance to the house, and I was always one of the very last people to leave because, you know, the kibbutzniks would just hang about and help clean up, and then, you know, like I don't have far to go get home, and I went to go get my shoes at the end of the night, and they were not there. And somebody else's slightly similar pair of shoes were there. And so, like, you know, for a week, I walked a mile in another person's shoes.
You wore the shoes?
I had no other shoes. I had one pair of shoes. And I had to wear the shoes. But, you know, like that person also didn't want to be wearing my shoes. So, but it took like, this is before smartphones and stuff. So, you know, it took like a week for us to like get connected and get our shoes back on each other's feet. But like, I think that's also, it's evocative of like the randomness and the craziness, but also like the warmth and like the resourcefulness. Like, yeah, you got to wear another pair of shoes, but it's kind of okay. And there's like a community spirit about everything.
Okay, that I think that's one of my favorite parts. I was gonna play you a video. For now, I'm gonna hold off. I was going to hold off, so I can talk a bit about my own memories of the kibbutz. Here we go. Let's see if I can unshare here. Very good. Okay, so let's see. So I asked myself some of the same questions I asked the people that I spoke to, the former kibbutzniks, and here's what I came up with. First, a particularly vivid memory or story from my time at the kibbutz. We had a visitor at one point from out of town whose name is Rains Cohen, and he had built a quadricycle, which was a four-wheel, 4-passenger, pedal-powered vehicle, and the seats were boat seats. They had been repurposed from a boat, and they swiveled. And so Rains kindly offered that any kibbutz residents who wanted to, or community members who were around, who wanted to ride it, could ride it. And so, of course, a number of us were interested. I remember, you know, it was very clearly not street legal, but we were on a dead-end street, so where better to try out such a vehicle. We rode it down the block to the pub, and the people at the pub were so delighted by the quadricycle that we were offered free drinks, everyone who was on the quadricycle. So we, you know, drank the drinks at the pub and then quadricycled back to the house. Another big memory is the final Shabbat dinner at the kibbutz in 2012. I went to that with my now wife, Elizabeth, And that allowed me to kind of give her a sense of what the kibbutz community had been like. And finally, the Israeli film series that I curated, I really didn't know much about Israeli film at all before doing that. And of course, now I help run the Jewish Film Festival here. So I think it was a very formative experience and a very helpful one. I remember one summer at the kibbutz, I decided to experiment with different ice cream recipes. I had lived in New York City and I had eaten wasabi ice cream there. So for those who may not remember, wasabi is the little paste. It's the green, very spicy paste that comes with sushi usually. So I had to have wasabi flavored ice cream in New York. So I recreated it at the kibbutz. It actually turned out pretty well. A challenging thing about the kibbutz life, I think, was interpersonal drama, which I think is true for any communal housing situation. And then communication that was not as direct as it could have been. But again, very typical for any kind of co-housing or communal housing. The kibbutz helped me realize, though, how much I prefer or appreciate home-based Jewish life, ritual, and practice. It was such a cornerstone of life, and it all took place in our own homes. And it really helped me feel more confident in my identity as a Jewish person who does prefer home-based Jewish life. Yeah, and other than that, you know, my time at the kibbutz helped revive my Jewish identity. I think I felt pretty ambivalent in many ways about being Jewish until I reached that community and I got a sense I can feel like I belong, you know, and that also I had to be part of building and maintaining communities like that if I wanted them to remain viable. So after all of this, I wanted to talk very briefly, and then I'll be done, about why does it matter? Why does it matter that a bunch of Jewish young adults, you know, got together and made this happen for 5 years in Seattle? And I think of it in terms of the context of Jewish communal life in America, and specifically the recent Pew study, the Pew 2020 study on Jewish life in America. So first of all, the phenomenon of post-denominational Jewish community is increasingly a thing. It is kind of trending. And Moisha House, which I mentioned earlier, actually explicitly describes itself as post-denominational Jewish community. And that is really what the kibbutz represented. And I would also say a tactic that is now, you know, being attempted by larger mainstream institutional Jewish organizations is to try to connect or reconnect Jewish young adults to their Jewish identity, but success tends to look more like empowering them and trusting them to build community and identity on their own terms, and less like trying to figure out what they want and providing it to them in a sort of a prefabricated way. So, you know, there are a number of models now that do this. The Moisha House model I mentioned put resources behind young adults making their own community. But also One Table, which is an organization that financially supports Jews having Shabbat dinner together. And then PJ Library, which has a get-together program that financially supports Jewish families and interfaith families gathering for events. So this is a model that's increasingly common because people, especially if they're unaffiliated, want to be empowered to create their own communities and not have to fit into an existing box. I would also say, you know, it's important to have communities like the Ravenna Kibbutz because it exposed me to modern Orthodox Jewish life and required me to respect and understand kashrut and Shomer Shabbos practices. It was a diverse Jewish community in terms of politics, religion, primary language, birthplace, singles or couples, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, age and ethnicity. It had a lot of diversity, and especially now, you know, there is the danger of siloing ourselves, surrounding us with people like us. And the Ravenna Kibbutz really prevented that, at least Jewishly. It prevented it within the context of being Jewish. Yeah, and I mean, you know, the way Ravenna Kibbutz was a creative, evolving Jewish community. It felt alive and fresh and picked up some quote unquote misfit toys, myself included, who didn't feel a great sense of belonging in an organized synagogue community or any of the establishment mainstream Jewish venues or organizations in town. And that is the way things are going for a significant segment of the American Jewish population. And that's where the Pew study comes in. So the Pew 2020 study said that 40% of US Jews 18 to 29 identify as Jews of no religion. And that means activities in Jewish life beyond attending shul are vital to keep these folks connected to Jewish identity. And 33%, a third of Jews 30 to 49 identify the same way. And the kibbutz was a place where there was sort of faith tradition as well, but there was a lot of emphasis on cultural experiences. And that is what tends to grab these folks who identify as Jews in no religion. The same groups that I just discussed tend to be unaffiliated. And so again, no denomination or post-denominational community appeals to them. And, you know, among the reasons that people gave in the survey for not attending shul, a common explanation was, I express my Jewishness in other ways, and Jewish cultural engagement is a big share of that. You know, there are a number of ways that, you know, fit into that, and one of them is cooking and eating traditional Jewish food. That's the number one given in the survey, and that, of course, was a staple of kibbutz life. Marking Shabbat in ways meaningful to them, also part of kibbutz life. Sharing culture holidays with non-Jewish friends, we certainly did that. And consuming Jewish culture in the form of newspapers, other media, literature, music, TV, and movies. So all aspects of what the kibbutz presented to the larger community. And so I do think that even if the kibbutz, you know, was a 5-year experiment, it represents some trends in Jewish communal life in America that I think are worth noting and paying attention to. So that is my presentation. I see I already have a question, so let me address it. Do you know what, if anything, succeeded the Ravenna Kibbutz to give young Jews a sense of community? Right, so there was a short-lived, as far as I know, short-lived outgrowth after the kibbutz ended that was called something like the Seattle Shabbat Potluck Co-op or something like that. And the idea was to continue regular Friday night dinners that would rotate from house to house, which of course is a very common way to do things. And I don't know that it really took off. And the reason I say that is because that's what the Ravenna Kibbutz Facebook group turned into. And I kind of watched its progress and there wasn't much. I mean, it didn't really kind of take off as far as I could tell. I could be wrong, but I don't think it really exists as such anymore. But yeah, there was an attempt to kind of keep the energy going. And it was difficult to do without those homes, those very lived in spaces that the residents opened up to a larger community every week and often multiple times a week. Did this kind of experience crop up in other parts of the US? I mean, I think that it is, it's what Moisha House and organizations or projects like that are trying to do, which is help organic or grassroots Jewish home life grow outside of just the context of sort of families with children kind of thing. Because families with children are not always in the best position to do public programming and open their homes up because they're very busy with a lot of other things. It's a life stage thing. So Moisha House, I mean, that the idea of Moisha House, their whole phrase is post-college, pre-family. So they're trying to get Jewish young adults at this critical stage and, you know, keep their Jewish engagement strong or increase their Jewish engagement by involving them in this kind of thing. But that age bracket can be, I think now they're a little more flexible with who attends. In other words, if Moisha House does a Shabbat dinner and someone attends who's 35, not 32, I don't think they, you know, have to leave or something. But at the time, Moisha House was very focused on this particular age bracket. And that was hard for us. And eventually we did part ways. The kibbutz parted ways with Moisha House and just wasn't getting the subsidies anymore. And we were independent. But for a while, it really helped us get off the ground. And of course, plenty of people who came were in that bracket. And so for a while, it really worked well. Okay, any other questions or comments from anyone who's with us today?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So you interviewed several people. Are those people that you actually stay in contact with on a regular basis now?
So it's funny, the people that I talked to, so Sergi, I had not spoken with at all, not for any particular reason, but we just don't live in the same city anymore since the kibbutz times. Same with Masha. Sebastian, as I mentioned, helped to organize the program we had right here in virtual space last month. He's the director of Plus Canada. But I also, until that project, I hadn't been in touch with him. It was delightful to be in touch. Miley, I had stayed with her a year or two after I moved to Spokane, when I attended Joel Rothschild's wedding. So that was a kind of a reunion in a way of Kibbutz Nikim. Yeah, I mean, the fact is, these folks, I mean, I think except for Sebastian, who lives in Montreal, they all live in Seattle. So I don't see them very much anymore. I think maybe now I will, though, after having gotten in touch again. And you know, the sentimental part of me wants to have a kibbutz reunion someday, but I don't know if that will happen. It may have to be a partial reunion, but I think it would be lovely.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
I think what a wonderful thing it would have been to have had that during the pandemic. I couldn't help but think, and it's too bad that it came to an end in a way. I can really understand the Shabbat dinners being really something everyone looked forward to, and very interesting. Thank you.
Sure. You know, there was a movement at some point within the kibbutz residents to see if we could make the kibbutz more permanent, and the only way we could really think of was to buy the houses. But anyone who knows Seattle knows that even then, in Ravenna, the cost of buying a house, especially, I mean, House Gimel, the biggest house, is and was gorgeous and very large. I mean, I don't know how many grants we would need, but you can't just buy houses like that. And now, you know, it's astronomical. I think it might be close to 2 million that Gimel last sold for pretty recently. So the point is, we weren't in a position where we knew how to make it permanent. And when the landlords decided to sell, we had no choice. And so it is sad, but it was also a project that structurally, I mean, we didn't know how to make it permanent. And the other thing is, with a lot of turnover over the years with the residents, that was a challenge. You have to have a core group that's committed to really living there and keeping it running. And for a while we did, but who knows how long that would have lasted, even if we'd been able to hold on to the homes.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was a memorable time, to be sure. So before I end, any other comments or questions?
Well, okay. When you mentioned the drama in the house, which is kind of one thing that was not a positive, what were some of the things you think that caused the drama in the house?
Well, I wish it was an exciting answer. I think a lot of it is pretty pedestrian, pretty mundane. Personality differences, and the fact is, if you interview someone and they applied on paper, right? You still don't know how it's going to work day to day with them in the mix. And it wasn't just about placing them in one house, although that matters, who you're literally living with, but it was how do they do across the whole spectrum of all the resident organizers and in the larger community. And, you know, I think sometimes the kibbutz, you know, residents did better than other times at figuring out, okay, will this person really work with what we're doing? And so, yeah, personality conflict, I think that you can probably imagine, if you try, that there may have been romances, even within just the residents, that may have turned sour and caused things to become, this wasn't a common occurrence, but it was an occurrence. And then, you know, within the larger community, that definitely happened. So the thing about that age bracket, and again, there were members who were older than early 30s, but the general sort of young adultish age bracket is that there's still, for many people, a lot of turmoil and instability. Some people, no, but for a lot of people there is, and that means that, you know, a person may have difficulty kind of being a reliable sort of torchbearer for something like this. So they may be a short-lived resident or whatever. But yeah, I mean, nothing particularly unusual and nothing specific, I think, really to Jewish community. I think it's a struggle for any co-housing or other communal housing project.
You know, I wonder, even in Israel, very few kibbutz survived over time. In fact, I have friends who lived on one that was incredibly active in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and then slowly, you know, dissolved into something that really didn't resemble what kibbutz was all about, although people still live there. And I don't know, are there any that have actually survived in their original form? I haven't kept up with that.
That's a good question. I mean, original form, my understanding, and I could be wrong, I'm hardly an expert. My understanding is that originally kibbutz nikim in Israel, or not kibbutz nikim, kibbutzim, there we go, in Israel were quite socialistic, right? And I think that my understanding is that's the main thing that's sort of shifted, is that even the ones where that's still part of the model have had to kind of move more towards a kind of capitalistic, at least semi-capitalistic model. But also, yeah, I mean, I think the sort of level of industry that the kibbutzim represent in terms of producing, I mean, fruits and vegetables and all kinds of other things too, has decreased, right? But the history of, I mean, the kibbutz has its own very long, as a phenomenon, has its own very long Wikipedia article, which is fascinating. And many sources that it lists there are probably worth reading. But yeah, I think people sometimes misunderstood what we meant by urban kibbutz. And so we did a lot of explaining of what we did mean. But I don't know, I think it still kind of fit that label, even though it made people think of kibbutzim in Israel, and that wasn't exactly what we had in mind. But there was a similar kind of feeling of shared communal responsibility for the challenges of life, you know, working together to I don't know, make life more livable, more shared in all ways.
There, I am aware of groups of young people that live together communally in Israel that all belong to Young Judea. When they were young, then they were all either part of it in Israel or the United States. And then when they graduated Young Judea and they went out in the world, they wanted to live together. And so there are definite apartments. They don't call themselves, they're called communal living apartments, where groups live and share rooms in it and share food and have wonderful Shabbat evenings. But I think that's probably the extent of what they do. And then when they meet someone or they get more settled in life, they move on. But I think you're sharing about the acceptance that happens in that kind of living, and the richness of a Shabbat and making it together is really something unique. And I know in Seattle, the University of Washington Hillel tries to be open for Shabbat dinners and to bring kids from the university in, but it's a hard sell if you're not looking for a particular kind of life.
It's true. And I will say, I mean, it's heartening to me. I remember years ago in Seattle when the Kavanah Cooperative began, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. As I understand it, Kavanah, I don't know if it's still, but it opened as either non-denominational, or it wasn't restricted to one or another denomination. It was a group that didn't fit all the labels, and it wasn't necessarily a synagogue. I mean, it was a community, and they did worship and so forth. But you know, and it's heartening whenever I see something like that arise, and it's certainly heartening when something flourishes, that it's sort of outside of the usual paradigms, because there will always be people in Jewish communities who are seeking that, and it's just a question of whether they can find it near them. And I would say during the pandemic, I would imagine, because so much happened virtually, that a lot of people did some like very interesting shul shopping that they couldn't have normally done, and they may not be able to attend those places in person, but maybe one day they'll move to it. I mean, you never know. But it's just, that's been an interesting phenomenon too. So I don't want to overextend my welcome here, but I do want to thank you all for attending. You can probably tell this was a very meaningful time of life for me, and I think it's also, I don't know, just something to think about when thinking about what Jewish communal life looks like in America. So thank you for being here today.
Thanks for sharing that, Neal.
Thank you, Neal.
Thanks, Neal.
Thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
It was lovely. Thank you.
All right. Well, take care, everyone, and I'm sure I'll see you
Thank
again
you.
sometime soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
That's a good day.